The millionaire disinherited his daughter from marrying a beggar and was left paralyzed when he saw what? In the spacious hall of the Montenegro mansion, the sound of Luisa's heels echoed as she paced back and forth, arms crossed, a look of unease on her face. She knew a confrontation with her father was inevitable. Alvaro Montenegro, her father, had requested her presence in the room for a serious conversation. She already knew the tone. Serious, for him, always meant control, imposition, suffocating rules that never took her feelings into account. The conversation would revolve around the same topic as always. His expectations for her, the grand destiny he had meticulously planned without ever asking what she really wanted. Alvaro sat in his brown leather armchair, rigid posture, his stern face framed by gray, well-groomed hair. In front of him, the large hardwood table was covered with documents, symbols of his wealth and power. He didn't look up when Luisa entered, but the air around seemed to freeze at the sound of his firm, cutting voice. "Luisa, finally," he began, without preamble, lifting his gaze just enough to meet hers. His eyes were hard, as if each word he planned to say was already decided, as immovable as the walls of that house. "Sit down. We need to talk." She took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment. But instead of obeying, she remained standing, her defiant eyes fixed on him. Alvaro raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by the lack of submission. It was rare for Luisa to dare confront him that way. Throughout her life, he had managed to mold her to his will. But lately, something in her was different, a silent flame he couldn't understand, and certainly didn't approve of. "So," he continued, ignoring the veiled challenge, "I heard you turned down Fernando's offer. A good young man, successful, with a bright future ahead, son of a respectable family, someone who would honor our name." He paused, analyzing his daughter's reactions, waiting for some explanation, but she just watched him with an expression somewhere between sadness and determination. "Would you care to explain what exactly is going through your head, Luisa?" It took her a few moments to respond, as if searching for the right words. "Fernando is a good man, yes," she finally said, "but I feel nothing for him, and I won't marry someone I don't love, father." Alvaro scoffed, impatient, his hands clenched in fists on the table. "Love? Are you telling me you're still clinging to this romantic, naive idea? Do you think love will put food on the table, will guarantee a comfortable life? That cheap sentimentality is for the weak, Luisa, for people who don't know what it takes to reach the top." "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm, "I don't want a life at the top if it means giving up who I am. I don't want to live like you, surrounded by people who only care about your money. I want something more. I want to be happy." "Happy?" Alvaro laughed, a cold sound full of disdain. "Happiness is a luxury, Luisa, something common people chase while we control what truly matters. Power, influence, respect. Who needs happiness when you can have the world at your feet? But you seem insistent on this foolish idea. If you keep this up, you'll end up like your mother, lost in dreams and disappointments." The mention of her mother made Luisa shudder, but she held her ground. Her eyes, once melancholic, now gleamed with an intensity he rarely saw. "Don't speak of mother that way. She was the only real person in this house. The only one who knew what love was, what compassion was. She taught me to see the value in people, not in the things they own." Alvaro's expression hardened even more. "And look what that got her. Your mother was weak, Luisa. If it were up to her, you wouldn't have half the opportunities you have today. It's thanks to me that you grew up with the best of everything, that you never had to dirty your hands. But what has that brought me, father? What have I gained by living as a prisoner in the midst of all this luxury? I don't care about your parties, your business friends, the money." She approached him, her hands shaking with anger and frustration. You build an empire but forgot to build a family. You forgot to build something that really mattered. For a moment, Alvaro remained silent, absorbing the impact of his daughter's words. He clenched his fists even tighter, but his face maintained an impenetrable coldness. You speak like a naive person, Luisa, like a fool who doesn't understand the real world. Let me tell you something. You will ruin your life if you continue with these silly ideas of love and kindness. He spat out the words with contempt. The world is not this fairy tale you've invented in your head. You belong to this world, and one day you'll realize you need a partner who is worthy of our position. She stepped back, tears already gathering in her eyes, but she didn't waver in her conviction. If that's the price to live in your world, then I'd rather not belong to it. I prefer a simple life, a life with purpose and truth, something you will never understand. He stood up, his expression threatening. Then, if that's the case, maybe you have no place in the Montenegro family. Wake up, Luisa. You're throwing away the brilliant future I planned for you. Luisa felt a mix of sadness and revolt, her throat tight with hurt, but her voice came out firm. If your brilliant future means an empty life, a life where money is worth more than any feeling, then I don't want any of it, Father. She turned her back, head held high, with the determination of someone who had made the hardest choice. I want real happiness. I won't give that up. As she left the room, Luisa could barely control her tears, but she felt lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She knew she was crossing a dangerous line, that defying her father could have serious consequences. But for the first time in a long time, she felt she was following her own heart. Behind her, Alvaro watched the door close with a dark expression. To him, it was incomprehensible that his daughter would rebel in this way. After everything he had built, the world, to Alvaro, was made of orders and control, and now he felt he was losing command of his own family. And he would not allow it. No matter what it took, Luisa would learn the lesson, even if it had to be the hard way. A few days after the heated argument with her father, Luisa felt an emptiness inside, a kind of pain that was both emotional and physical. She remembered every word exchanged in that room, the way Alvaro looked at her, cold and unable to understand what she truly wanted. That morning, after a nearly sleepless night, she decided she needed to get out, breathe, escape the oppression of the Montenegro mansion and that environment where every painting, every piece of furniture seemed to watch her steps and judge her choices. She walked through the city center streets, alone, without direction, dressed more simply in a light blouse and jeans. Luisa looked like any other young woman her age, but her gaze was distant, thoughtful. The world around her was a blur of voices and movement. Hurried people, honking cars, street vendors trying to catch passersby's attention. She felt almost invisible, and at that moment, she appreciated the sense of anonymity. At a certain point, Luisa stopped in a busy square, where people rushed by, each immersed in their own concerns. She watched children playing in the distance, laughing and running, as if there was nothing wrong with the world. And for a moment, she wished she could be a child again, to live in a world without so many expectations and demands. Then her eyes fixed on a man sitting on the sidewalk near a newsstand. He was leaning against the wall, legs stretched out, with a serene expression on his face. His clothes were worn, his shoes mismatched and a bit torn, but his gaze, there was something in it that touched her deeply. It was as if this man radiated a peace that sharply contrasted with the chaos around him. She stopped, hesitating. He noticed her and offered a timid, almost shy smile, yet it seemed genuine. Beside him, a handwritten sign read, "Any help is welcome. God bless." Intrigued, Luisa approached slowly, as if afraid to break the tranquil aura he radiated. The man observed her, but without the invasive curiosity she was used to seeing in others. His eyes were brown and kind, and she realized he was younger than he appeared from a distance, perhaps in his 20s. She tried to think of something to say, a question that didn't sound condescending, but he took the initiative. "Good morning," he said in a surprisingly gentle voice. "Is everything okay?" He seemed sincere, as if he truly cared about her well-being, though he was the one sitting on the sidewalk, on the margins of society. Louisa let out a nervous sigh. I think so," she replied, though she knew her expression betrayed her. "I just saw you here and sorry, I hope you don't think I'm intruding." The young man smiled, a smile that unexpectedly lit up his face, as if that moment was a welcome pause in his solitary routine. "Don't worry. Sometimes people stop to talk. Other times they just walk by. It happens." She felt a bit more at ease. "What's your name?" she asked, sincere curiosity reflected in her eyes. "Raphael," he replied, nodding slightly. "And yours?" "Louisa," she said, returning the nod with a small smile. A comfortable silence settled between them, until she couldn't resist and asked, "Can I sit here with you?" Raphael looked surprised but gestured kindly, indicating the space beside him. "Sure," he replied, still with that peaceful glow in his eyes. She sat down, ignoring the people passing by who looked at her strangely, perhaps finding it unusual that such a well-dressed young woman would sit beside a beggar. "So, Louisa," he began, observing the movement around them. "What brings you here today?" She hesitated, wondering what she could tell a complete stranger. Still, something about him made her open up, perhaps because he looked at her in a way no one else did, without judgment. "I just needed some time away from home. I feel trapped in a life that isn't mine, and I'm trying to understand what really matters." Raphael nodded, listening attentively. "I know what it's like to lose everything that once seemed important," he said thoughtfully. "But when that happens, we sometimes discover that what we thought was essential wasn't at all. That true value lies in the small things, not in what we own." Louisa looked at him, intrigued. "What do you mean? What happened to you?" He took a deep breath, looking away for a moment. "I had a very different life. I had a job, a house, a family, but I lost it all gradually. First, my mother got sick, and all the money went to take care of her. Then I lost my job, and with that came a series of difficulties that brought me here." He gave a sad but resigned smile. "But somehow, I found a peace I didn't know before. It was faith that kept me going, the hope that even when everything seems lost, there's a purpose to everything." She listened fascinated. It was a world she didn't know, a world where real challenges were faced, where difficulties couldn't be bought off or ignored. And more than that, it was the world of someone who, even with so little, still maintained dignity and faith. I've never met anyone like you," she murmured, almost without realizing it. "Someone who lost so much, but still believes in something greater." Raphael laughed softly, a light, comforting sound. "I believe that what really matters in life isn't what we have, but who we are," he replied, with a serene glow in his eyes. "My situation could be different tomorrow, but who I am, no one can take that away." Those words resonated deeply within her. It was a perspective she had never considered, raised as she was in an environment where having always mattered more than being. "You must think I'm ridiculous," she said, embarrassed. "I have everything, and yet here I am, searching for something I can't even define." "I don't think it's ridiculous," Raphael replied with a sincerity that made Louisa blush. "I think, in a way, you're closer to what you really want than you realize. And sometimes, we need to lose our way a little to finally find what truly matters." She took a deep breath, absorbing those words. On impulse, Louisa reached in her pocket and pulled out some bills, holding them out to him. Please accept this, she said hesitantly. It's not much, but maybe it'll help. Raphael looked at the money for a moment, then shook his head, gently returning it. I really appreciate it, but more important than any money was having this conversation. Today, you reminded me that even when we're on the margins, we can still be seen as human beings. She felt her face flush, touched by the nobility of that gesture. It was a brutal contrast to everything she knew. Here was a man who had so little and, even so, refused something many would accept without hesitation. You're one of the richest people I've ever met, Raphael, she whispered, moved. The two remained silent, letting their exchanged glances speak for themselves. Louisa felt that this encounter had planted a seed in her heart, something she didn't yet understand but knew was significant. For some reason, she didn't want to leave. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only a comforting silence and the strange feeling that, in that moment, their souls met in a dimension far beyond appearances. Finally, Raphael broke the silence, standing up slowly. Thank you for the company, Louisa. It was special. She smiled, feeling that this was the beginning of something. It was for me too, Raphael. I hope to see you again. He waved with a gentle smile before walking away, blending into the crowd like an ephemeral figure, but one who had left an indelible mark. Louisa remained there alone, sensing that, somehow, her life had just changed, though she didn't yet know to what extent. In the weeks that followed, Louisa couldn't get Raphael out of her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, his serene face and that gentle smile returned to her thoughts like a sweet and persistent memory. Against everything she had always believed about appropriateness, something in her felt inexplicably drawn to him. Raphael represented everything her father despised. He was poor, lived on the margins, and yet seemed to possess an inner peace she had never known. Determined to see him again, Louisa began frequenting the square where she had met him. At first, she disguised herself, wearing simpler clothes and a cap to avoid attracting attention. The last thing she wanted was for someone in society to see her talking to a beggar. She feared judgment, but even more so feared what her father would do if he found out. After all, Alvaro's control over her seemed limitless. It was on a Saturday morning that she saw him again. Raphael was sitting in the same spot, legs crossed, with an old book in his hands. Louisa approached slowly, hesitating, her heart racing with anxiety and nervousness. He saw her from afar and raised his face, surprised and visibly happy. "Louisa, I didn't expect to see you here again." She smiled, blushing slightly. "I had to come back. I wanted to see how you are." Raphael closed the book and set it aside, looking at her with a caring yet slightly bewildered expression. "I'm doing well, all things considered," he said with that serene tone she so admired. "And you? You seem different as well." She laughed, a bit nervously, feeling that he perceived her in a way no one else could. "Different, maybe because for the first time I'm doing something for myself." Raphael smiled. "That's good to hear. Sometimes we need courage to follow our hearts." From that day on, Louisa and Raphael's meetings became regular. Always in the square, always with the same discretion. With each conversation, she felt closer to him, as if her soul was finally finding a safe space to be her true self. It didn't matter that he lacked everything her family expected. Next to Raphael, Louisa felt alive, as if something in her heart was finally awakening. Their conversations flowed naturally, without the formality and superficiality of the social circles in which she had grown up. He told her stories from his life before his downfall, how he had been a young man full of dreams, with hopes and plans to help his mother and build a family of his own. He talked about his simple childhood in the countryside, the little joys he found in the most ordinary things, like the smell of fresh coffee or playing in the rain. In turn, Luisa shared with him her world of suffocating expectations and a family that treated feelings as weaknesses. Raphael listened patiently, without judgment. He seemed to understand her pain intuitively, as if he had experienced something similar. And next to him, she didn't have to pretend to be the perfect daughter. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park, Raphael surprised her. "Luisa, I need to ask, why do you keep coming back? Don't get me wrong, I'm glad, but we come from such different worlds." She stopped and looked into his eyes, hesitating for a second before holding his hand. "Because when I'm with you, I feel like I'm finally living. I feel that for the first time, I'm with someone who truly sees me, without masks." He observed her for a moment, clearly moved. "Luisa, you know I can't offer you anything. I have no wealth, no status. All I have is this faith that somehow there's still something good for us." She squeezed his hand with a determined expression. "I don't want wealth. I've spent my life surrounded by it, and it's never brought me happiness. With you, I find peace. I find meaning." For a moment, he seemed confused, as if the idea was something he had never dared to imagine. "Would you really be willing to give up everything for someone like me?" He murmured, almost as if he couldn't believe she might truly consider such a thing. Her eyes shone with emotion and sincerity. "To live a life with true love, yes," she replied with a firmness she had never known she had. "What is money compared to what I feel when I'm with you?" Raphael lowered his head, clearly moved, his eyes misty. He had grown accustomed to loneliness, to the disdain of people who saw him only as a burden or an unwanted figure. The idea that someone like Luisa, a woman raised in comfort and luxury, could see him as someone worthy of love was almost impossible to believe. "Luisa," he said after a long silence, "you are a gift that life gave me when I least expected it. But I'm afraid that your father will never accept this, and that you might end up regretting it." She gently touched his face, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "I know my father will never accept this, but from now on I choose my own path, not him. I'm no longer afraid to follow my heart." They stood in silence, simply looking at each other. In that moment, the park's noise, the buzz of voices, and the distant sound of cars seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, connected by something deeper and unshakable. Raphael pulled her slightly toward him, and she closed her eyes as she felt the soft touch of his lips. It was a delicate kiss, as if both feared reality might tear them apart. After that day, Luisa and Raphael's relationship deepened. They met secretly in different locations around the city, away from curious gazes, away from society's vigilant eyes. She would bring him clothes and food, small things that could improve his life, but Raphael always accepted them humbly, never asking for anything. In return, he offered her something no money could buy, the peace and happiness she had long sought. Luisa knew she was treading on dangerous ground. Each clandestine meeting, each exchange of looks and secret touches, brought her closer to an abyss of unpredictable consequences. But as much as reason tried to warn her, her heart had already made its choice. And somewhere deep in her mind, she knew it wouldn't be long before her father found out. The news hit the Montenegro mansion like a bomb. It was a cloudy afternoon when Alvaro Montenegro entered his office, his steps heavy and his face rigid. His usually cold expression now carried a hint of contained anger. His contacts in the city, always attentive to every detail of the lives of those in high society, had brought him a rumor, a piece of gossip he struggled to believe, but at the same time knew could be true. He was informed now. He knew about the meetings, the secret escapes, the hours Luisa spent with a vagrant in a public square. A beggar, they had told him, someone who lived off alms, scraps, someone without a cent to his name. He couldn't conceive that his daughter, raised for luxury and elegance, was lowering herself to the level of someone he viewed as the scum of society. It didn't take long for Louisa to sense something was wrong. When she arrived home, she was greeted by the severe gazes of the staff, who avoided looking her directly in the eyes, as if something dark hung over the atmosphere. She climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of a bad premonition, but before she could reach her room, one of the maids intercepted her with a trembling voice. "Mr. Montenegro is waiting for you in the study," the woman said, not daring to look at her. Louisa felt a chill run up her spine. There was an urgency and tension in the air, and her heart began to beat faster. She took a deep breath, lifted her head, and headed to her father's study, preparing herself for what she knew was inevitable. When she opened the door, she saw Alvaro standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the mansion's gardens. He didn't turn when she entered, but his voice, low and controlled, cut through the silence like a blade. "Sit down," he ordered, still with his back to her. Louisa hesitated, but decided not to contradict him. She sat in the leather armchair in front of his desk, her hands clasped in her lap, waiting for him to continue. The silence in the room was oppressive, and the ticking of the large clock on the wall seemed to mark the seconds like the beat of a war drum. Finally, Alvaro turned around, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice cold and distant. She lifted her chin, determined not to show intimidation. "I imagine it has to do with Raphael." The mention of the young man's name made Alvaro's face harden even more. "So it's true," he muttered, almost to himself. He stepped closer, stopping beside the desk, his eyes piercing her as if trying to see into her soul. "My daughter, my only daughter, involved with a beggar." He pronounced the word with palpable disgust, as if he couldn't even bear the thought. Louisa felt anger rising within her, but struggled to keep calm. "Raphael is more than that, Father. He's a good man, someone who sees me for who I am, not for what you expect me to be." "Good?" Alvaro let out a bitter laugh. "Good? This man is nothing, Louisa. He lives on the streets, depends on the charity of others to survive. And you expect me to accept that my daughter, heir to the Montenegro family, is involved with someone like that? Do you think that's the kind of life I want for you?" Louisa took a deep breath, feeling the threat of tears but refusing to let them fall. "Father, I don't want a life based on money and appearances. I want a life with purpose, with love, with someone who truly cares about me." "Love?" He spat out the word as if it were poison. "Do you think this man loves you? He's just taking advantage of the opportunity, using you to climb up in life, to escape misery. And you, naive, are falling into this trap like a fool. Don't talk about him like that." Luisa's voice trembled with indignation. "You don't know him. You don't know who he is, what he's been through, the strength he has." Alvaro interrupted her, now practically shouting, "Silence. I don't care what he's been through. I didn't raise you to throw everything away for a nobody. This relationship will end now, Louisa. I demand that you end it immediately." She looked at him, her heart pounding, but the decision was already made within her. "I won't do it, Father," she said with a firmness that surprised even herself. "If ending things with Raphael means obeying you, then I choose to disobey." For a moment, shock appeared on Alvaro's face. He had always thought he had total control over his daughter, that she would never dare defy him. But now, seeing the determination in her eyes, he realized this young woman was no longer the submissive girl of before. Anger turned into something darker. Alvaro crossed his arms, breathing deeply, as if trying to contain the impulse to explode. "If you walk out that door, Louisa, you will no longer be my daughter. he said, his voice cold and calculated. "I will cut off all access to our fortune. You won't see a cent of the Montenegro money. If you choose this path, you'll be completely alone." His words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. He was offering her a brutal choice. Either remain loyal to the love she felt for Raphael, or sacrifice everything to remain part of the family. Louisa felt a pang of sadness and disappointment. She knew her father was a cold man, but she never imagined he would reject her so easily. She rose slowly, her eyes filled with tears but brimming with determination. "Then I'll go, Father," she replied in a voice that seemed surprisingly steady. "Because I'd rather be poor and happy with someone who truly loves me than rich and empty, like you." For a moment, Alvaro remained silent, as if her words had struck him like a punch. But his face quickly assumed an expression of icy indifference. "Very well," he said with a calmness more frightening than any scream. "You've made your choice. From now on, you're on your own. Leave my house, and don't come back." A tear rolled down Luisa's face, but she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she turned her back on her father and walked toward the door, keeping herself as straight as possible, fighting against the despair that threatened to engulf her heart. She knew that crossing that threshold meant leaving behind the comfortable and purposeless life she had always known. But she also knew that, for the first time, she was living according to what she truly believed. As she left, she heard Alvaro's voice, cold and distant, echoing behind her. "Never forget, Luisa. You chose this life. Don't come knocking on my door when misery finds you." She paused but didn't turn around. "Don't worry, Father. The true misery is the life you lead. I will be happy, even if it means facing hardships." And with those words, she crossed the door, never looking back. Outside, the wind felt colder, the reality harsher and more unforgiving. But at the same time, she felt free. As she walked down the mansion's long driveway, a mix of fear and freedom filled her chest. The choice was made, and now she would have to face the consequences. Luisa took her phone, her hands trembling, and called Raphael. He answered almost immediately, his voice filled with surprise and concern upon hearing her tone. "Raphael," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "my father disowned me. I have nothing, only you." He was silent for a moment, then replied with a sweetness that brought unexpected comfort to her heart. "Then come, Luisa. I don't have much, but everything I have is yours. We'll face this together." Hearing those words, Luisa felt a wave of emotion sweep through her chest. She was beginning a new life, one that promised to be difficult and uncertain, but filled with something she had never truly known before: true love and freedom. The first days after being disowned were tough for Luisa, although Raphael had welcomed her with open arms. The reality she now faced was unrelenting and unlike anything she had ever experienced. Without money, without any support or safety net, she was forced to confront a world where every coin was counted, every meal was precious, and even simple needs required effort and sacrifice. They found a small room to rent in a modest boarding house in a more forgotten part of the city. It was a cramped space with a mattress on the floor and a wobbly table barely standing, but it was what they could afford. Luisa looked around on that first night, trying to hold back tears. The difference between that room and the luxurious one she had grown up in was overwhelming. But when she felt Raphael's hand intertwined with hers, she felt stronger. "Are you regretting it?" he asked, his voice soft but full of concern. She looked at him and squeezed his hand affectionately. "No, Raphael. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but a life by your side is worth any sacrifice." He smiled, his face illuminated by the simplicity of someone who had faced many battles. "Then let's face this together, one day at a time." From that moment on, Louisa began to discover what it truly meant to live with less, far less than anything she had ever known. She quickly realized that her luxurious education and her degree in business administration, obtained at her father's insistence, had little value in the practical world she now inhabited. No one in that neighborhood cared about her certificates or the prestige of the Montenegro name. She got her first job in a small, bustling diner. She spent her days cleaning tables, taking orders, and washing dishes. At first, the work was a shock. The strong smell of frying oil clung to her clothes. Her hands became rough and sore from the hot water and detergent, and the shifts felt endless. The nights when she returned to the small room beside Raphael were her only solace. He was always there, waiting for her with a tired but sincere smile, offering her a cup of warm tea and a few words of encouragement. He, too, worked hard to contribute, taking on odd jobs wherever he could. He worked as a porter at fairs, made deliveries by bicycle, painted walls, and even helped maintain some of the local shops. No job was beneath him, and watching him, Louisa began to see that there was a dignity, a quiet strength in that kind of humble work that she had never imagined. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, Louisa entered the room and sank onto the mattress, her arms aching. She closed her eyes and sighed as Raphael came over and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Was today tough?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. "It was," she murmured, almost breaking into tears. I don't know if I'm doing this right. I feel like, despite everything, I'm still not good enough for this life. Every day is a struggle." Raphael took her hands and looked at them, examining the small wounds and calluses that were beginning to appear on her skin. "These hands," he said, stroking the scars, "are the hands of a strong woman. You're adapting to a completely different world, and it takes time. But believe me, Louisa, you are much stronger than you think." She looked at him, feeling a wave of tenderness and gratitude. "I wouldn't be anything without you, Raphael. When I'm with you, somehow, everything feels worth it. And even in the hardships, I feel a happiness I never felt before." He smiled and pulled her into an embrace, resting his forehead against hers. "We don't have much, but we have each other. And that's more than any wealth." Every day, Louisa realized that the simplicity she now lived in, though harsh, was rich in a way the world she had grown up in had never been. She began to see beauty in the small things: the sunrise over the humble neighborhood, the laughter of children playing in the street, the smell of fresh bread wafting from local bakeries in the early morning. Raphael taught her to see life with new eyes, to appreciate what truly mattered. In that same neighborhood, she formed friendships she would never have imagined. She met Donna Cecilia, the elderly neighbor who lived alone on the floor above and spent her afternoons watching the street from her window. Donna Cecilia was a widow who lived on a small pension, yet she would offer Louisa and Raphael rain cookies whenever she could make some. There was also Miguel, the boy who sold sweets on the corner and always came asking for help with his homework. These people, with so little, seemed more generous and supportive than anyone she had known in her old life. One Sunday afternoon, as Raphael and Louisa returned from the local church, where they had started attending services, he stopped and held her hand. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a small vacant lot near the neighborhood. It was an untended space with a few trees and shrubs, but Raphael guided her to a part where the grass was low and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He sat beside her, and together they watched the sky. "When I was a child," Raphael said, with a nostalgic smile, My mother always brought me to places like this. She would say that no matter how hard life gets, we can always look at the sky and remember that we're part of something bigger. Louisa leaned against his shoulder, feeling at peace. Sometimes, I feel like I've finally found my true home, Raphael. It doesn't matter where we are, as long as I have you by my side. And so, in that simplicity, they build a routine together, finding happiness in the small victories and tender moments they shared. Life was hard, but each day together seemed to strengthen the love they felt for one another. A love that didn't depend on anything external, but grew through resilience and mutual support. Louisa knew that at any moment, she could try to approach her father, beg for forgiveness, and perhaps regain the life of comfort and security she once had. But the thought of returning to that empty, purposeless world and abandoning Raphael never truly crossed her mind. Instead, each day by his side seemed to reaffirm the choice she had made, even when the harsh reality of poverty became overwhelming. With him, she felt that she was finally living a life with purpose, discovering the strength of her own faith and the ability to face any difficulty with courage and dignity. On a particularly difficult day, after hours of hard work, Louisa and Raphael sat at the small table in their room, sharing a simple soup they had managed to prepare with what little they had. They ate in silence, but with a smile of shared understanding. Raphael held her hand for a moment and said, with a tenderness that almost made her cry, "You know, Louisa, I know I can't give you much, but as long as we're together, I promise I'll always fight to see you happy." She squeezed his hand, feeling deeply grateful. "And I never doubted that, Raphael, because the happiness I have with you is something I would never trade, not even for all the riches in the world." And so, day by day, they continued to face difficulties together, finding in the little things a greater purpose and the strength to keep going. Louisa was far from her old world, but alongside Raphael, she had discovered a new life, a life of true love, humility, and gratitude. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Though life was hard and challenges constant, Louisa and Raphael found a fragile balance, a peace in the simplicity of each day together. Mornings began early with the first rays of sunlight, illuminating the small room where they lived. Raphael usually left before her, searching for temporary work, while Louisa headed to the diner where she worked, now accustomed to the routine of serving customers, cleaning tables, and carrying heavy dishes. But life, so uncertain and unpredictable, had other plans for them. One rainy morning, Raphael woke up with a slight fever. He said nothing to Louisa, insisting it was just a passing cold. She knew him well enough to sense something was wrong, but understanding his stubbornness, she decided not to press. However, as the days passed, the fever didn't go away, and a persistent cough began to worsen. Raphael lost his appetite, and his once healthy face became pale and worn. Louisa tried to convince him to go to the hospital, but he always resisted, worried about the cost and the financial burden it might bring. After all, they barely had enough money for rent and bills. Healthcare was a luxury they had already renounced. "Raphael, please see a doctor," she pleaded one night as he coughed uncontrollably, clutching his chest in pain. "This isn't just a cold. I can see you're getting worse every day." He smiled, but it was a tired, almost sad smile. "Louisa, we can't afford it. I'll get better, I promise. I just need some rest." She pressed her lips together, frustrated and worried, but decided to respect his decision. Several more days passed, and Raphael continued to deteriorate. His cough intensified, his breathing became heavy and labored, and the light in his eyes began to fade. He who had always been so strong and full of life, now seemed fragile and vulnerable, as if he were fighting something far greater than himself. Finally, one morning, when his fever was higher than ever, Raphael could barely lift himself from the bed. The expression of pain on his face was enough to make Louisa decide. She helped him lie down again, covered him with an old blanket they had, and, not knowing exactly what to do, set out in search of help. She walked the streets, stopping at pharmacies, clinics, even churches, asking if anyone knew a doctor who could help for free or at a symbolic price. At every door, she found negative answers. Some suggested private hospitals, but those were far beyond their means. And in public hospitals, the lines were endless, with waits of days, sometimes weeks, for a consultation. She felt desperation growing in her chest, a suffocating anguish as she realized the man she loved was withering before her eyes, and she was helpless to do anything about it. Back in the small room, she knelt beside him, holding his hand gently. Raphael opened his eyes, weak and tired, but smiled at her with that tenderness that always brought comfort to her heart. I tried, Raphael," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I looked for help, went at every place I could, but no one can help us. I feel so powerless." He squeezed her hand lightly, an almost imperceptible gesture. "Don't blame yourself, Louisa. You've done more than anyone would. I'm at peace." She shook her head, refusing to accept those words. "Don't say that. You're not giving up. I won't let you give up." Raphael looked at the ceiling for a moment, struggling to breathe. "Have you noticed how beautiful the sky looks after the rain? How everything seems clearer, pure? It's as if God is showing us something." "Raphael, please." Louisa was now crying openly, her face wet and her voice choked. "Don't talk like that. Don't leave me." He turned his gaze to her, his expression calm despite his weakness. "I'll always be with you, Louisa. No matter what happens, our love is something that nothing can erase." And that night, while Raphael slept, Louisa, in complete despair, fell to her knees beside the bed and began to pray. It wasn't a beautiful or elaborate prayer. It was a cry, a plea. She had never been a religious person, but at that moment, there was nothing left to cling to except the faith Raphael had always mentioned. She begged for a miracle, for intervention, for anything that could save the man she loved. "Please, God, don't take him from me. He's all I have," she murmured through tears, her trembling hands clasped in prayer. "I know I was selfish. I know I had everything and didn't value it, but now I'm here, and he's everything to me. Don't let me lose him. Please, I'm begging you." She spent hours on her knees, repeating those words, pleading silently and through tears until exhaustion overcame her, and she fell asleep beside him, clutching his hand. In the days that followed, Raphael remained very weak, but Louisa refused to give up. She visited every possible place in search of medicine, prepared teas and home remedies that a kind neighbor had taught her. Even Donna Cecilia, the elderly neighbor, appeared with soups and herbs that promised to soothe the cough and strengthen his body. Then something strange began to happen. Gradually, Raphael started to show signs of improvement. First, his fever dropped slightly, allowing him to eat something after days of weakness. Next, the cough started to subside, and he could sleep for longer periods without being disturbed by discomfort. Each small improvement was a victory for Louisa. She cared for him with tireless dedication, watching over him every night, placing cool cloths on his forehead when the fever rose, holding his hand in silence whenever he seemed to lose strength. The recovery was slow but steady. After a few weeks, Raphael was able to get out of bed, still weak but with a shy, grateful smile. The neighbors, who had been following the situation closely, were astonished by his almost miraculous recovery. Many commented that they had never seen someone so sick recover without medical care. For Luisa, it was proof that her prayer had been heard. One afternoon, when Raphael could already walk to the square, they sat on a wooden bench under a tree, quietly feeling the gentle breeze on their faces. He held her hand and looked at her with deep gratitude. "Luisa, I don't even know how to thank you for everything you've done, for never giving up on me." She smiled, a solitary tear escaping from her eye. "I knew I couldn't give up, Raphael. You're my life now, and I knew that God wouldn't leave me without you." He nodded, his eyes misty. "I believe that too. God heard our plea, Luisa. All we can do is be grateful." She embraced him, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "And I promise never again to doubt what he is capable of," she whispered, with a newfound faith born from suffering and hope. That experience transformed them both profoundly. Soon, Raphael found a simple job as a construction helper on a nearby project, and gradually, they began to rebuild their lives. Nothing was easy, but having come so close to losing him, Luisa now saw every moment by his side as a gift. Raphael's health, though still fragile, continued to improve. With each passing day, he seemed stronger, more full of life, and Luisa felt a renewed joy seeing him get up each morning, ready to face another day by her side. Each little achievement, a step without support, a night without coughing, the simple fact of seeing him eat with more appetite, was, to her, a miracle, a blessing she no longer took for granted. With the return of his physical strength, Raphael started working regularly as a construction assistant. It wasn't an easy job, but he embraced it with gratitude and determination. He came home exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but always smiling as he crossed the door, often bringing her a small gift he had bought with his modest earnings. A flower, a piece of fresh bread, or a simple candy wrapped in fine paper. Luisa, in turn, still worked at the diner, but now with a new energy. With a peaceful heart and Raphael by her side, the weight of the days felt lighter. She spent her time serving customers, washing dishes and cleaning tables, but her spirit was stronger. Her co-workers, who once saw her as a lonely, displaced young woman, began to admire her strength and dedication. She had earned respect and friendship, simple, sincere bonds that were a relief amid the harshness of her new life. One day, as Luisa returned from work, she saw a scene that made her stop. At the entrance to the boarding house where they lived, Raphael was surrounded by neighborhood children, the same ones who spent their days playing in the street and selling little sweets to help their families. He was sitting on the ground with a contagious smile, holding an old, worn book and reading it enthusiastically while the children listened with wide, fascinated eyes. She watched from a distance, captivated. Raphael had nothing to offer but words and stories. Yet there he was, gathering those children around him like a beacon in the darkness. His love for people, his natural generosity, and the faith that never abandoned him all made Raphael an extraordinary man, far beyond appearances or material possessions. That night, after the children had dispersed, Raphael entered the small room and found Luisa waiting for him with a tender smile. "You're incredible, you know that?" she said, hugging him. "Even with nothing, you give so much to others." He laughed, a little embarrassed. "I was just reading to them. They're such curious kids, wanting to know about everything. I remember when I was young, I loved hearing stories too. Maybe I'm just giving back what I once received." She looked at him with admiration. "But that's exactly what makes you special. You never lost the ability to give, even when it seemed you had nothing." Raphael hugged her back, holding her tightly. And you, Louisa, are the one who gave me the strength to go on. If I'm here today, if I'm alive, it's because you believe for both of us." Over time, Raphael's recovery and their dedication to their work began to bring small improvements to their lives. Raphael's boss, a simple and hardworking man, noticed his efforts and started entrusting him with more important tasks, which earned Raphael small salary increases. At the diner, the owner, impressed with Luisa's reliability and care, began giving her more responsibilities and eventually offered her a small bonus. These small victories added up to a more stable life. With the little money left over, they managed to replace the old mattress with a simple but comfortable bed. They bought a new table and even some plates and glasses. Little by little, their small room began to feel like a home. One afternoon, as Luisa was finishing her shift, the diner owner, Mr. Jorge, called her for a chat. "Luisa, I've noticed your hard work, your honesty. You're never late, never complain, and you're always willing to help." He looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "I'm considering opening another diner in a nearby neighborhood. I want you to be in charge of it." Luisa froze for a moment. The idea of being responsible for a diner, of having something under her care, seemed surreal. She had never imagined that anyone would trust her with such a position, especially considering her lack of experience. "Mr. Jorge, I don't even know what to say. I've never done anything like this before," she replied, her voice trembling with surprise and gratitude. The man smiled. "I know you have a lot to learn, but you've already seen what it takes. And I know you have courage. All I need is for you to keep being as honest and hardworking as you've been. I trust you, Luisa. Take your time to think about it." As Luisa left the diner that night, she felt a mixture of euphoria and nervousness. She shared the news with Raphael, who embraced her, his eyes shining with pride. He encouraged her to accept the offer, saying it would be an important step for them, a new opportunity to build something together. With time, the new responsibilities brought Luisa challenges and lessons. She learned to coordinate the small diner's team, manage supplier orders, handle customers, and oversee finances. It was intense work, but she finally felt in control of her own life, as if this small establishment mirrored her growth and everything she had achieved alongside Raphael. The following months marked a true transformation. Raphael continued working in construction, but his talent with the neighborhood children hadn't gone unnoticed. One day, the director of a local school, impressed by the stories he'd heard, offered him a job as an assistant. Raphael accepted with an open heart, thrilled at the chance to teach and inspire the children, something he'd never imagined possible in his life. Now, the couple didn't just survive, they lived with purpose. Each day was a new opportunity to contribute to their community and to give back for the blessings they had received. In the neighborhood, they were known and cherished. Children would run to Raphael whenever they saw him, and the locals greeted Luisa with warmth and admiration. One night, after their simple dinner at the small table, Raphael held her hand and looked at her with a loving intensity. "Luisa, have you thought about how much has changed? How life has taken us down paths we never imagined?" She smiled, remembering everything they had faced together. "Yes, Raphael. One day I lost everything. Everything I thought defined me. But in that moment, I found you, and with you, I found who I truly am." He nodded, moved. "God is good. He led us through a difficult journey. But in the end, I think we found so much more than we could have wished for." She leaned on his shoulder, feeling a peace that once seemed unreachable. "Yes, and today I understand that everything we went through was necessary. The pain, the loss, the hardships, they all brought us here." Raphael gently stroked her hair, his eyes misty. "Now we have something that no amount of fortune could buy, a life with purpose and love." The lights of the small city twinkled in the distance through the window, and they sat in silence, letting the moment speak for itself. It was a silence of gratitude, of fulfillment, of a happiness that came not from wealth or status, but from simply being together, loving each other, and learning to trust in something greater. That night, Louisa fell asleep beside Raphael with a full heart. She knew challenges would still come, that life was uncertain, but she also knew that with him by her side, nothing was impossible. While Louisa and Raphael rebuilt their lives from nothing, Alvaro Montenegro, once powerful and feared, began facing a precipitous fall in fortune and prestige. What he had built over the years with ambition and coldness now seemed to be crumbling before his eyes, leading him into a spiral of despair and isolation. It all began with an investment Alvaro believed to be foolproof. He had risked a large sum of money on a new venture in the financial market, blindly trusting a few high-level friends who convinced him it was a guaranteed success. But the company he had helped fund turned out to be a fraud scheme. And when the media uncovered the scandal, the news spread quickly, tarnishing Alvaro's reputation and ruining his credibility. Gradually, other investors began to pull away. Longtime partners who once welcomed him with respect and deference now avoided any association with his name. He received fewer and fewer invitations to high society events, and those who once sought his advice and flattered him now ignored him. He felt betrayed, but deep down he knew his power had always been based on appearances. And now, without his fortune, the same people who called him a friend treated him with cold disdain. His streak of bad luck continued. With accumulating financial losses, Alvaro tried to sell some of his properties to cover debts, but the real estate market was down, and he was forced to sell for much less than he expected. In no time, the Montenegro mansion, a symbol of his pride and success, was also put up for sale. To his horror, the offers were far below the value he had imagined. Sitting alone in his empty office, surrounded by walls that had witnessed decades of his empire, Alvaro felt like a diminished man. There were no longer any employees around him. Those who once bowed to him now worked for new employers. The silence inside the mansion seemed to echo his own downfall. For the first time, Alvaro Montenegro felt a profound loneliness he had never experienced before. To worsen his situation, Alvaro began suffering from health issues he tried to ignore. The constant tension and stress were taking their toll. At first, he felt a persistent pain in his back and shoulders, but over time, the symptoms worsened. One morning, as he tried to get out of bed, he realized he couldn't move his right arm. A wave of panic overwhelmed him, but with the pride that always defined him, he refused to ask for help. Only when his condition became critical was he taken to the hospital. The diagnosis was brutal, a stroke which had resulted in partial paralysis of his right side. The doctor who attended him, a calm and straightforward man, explained that without intensive treatment and permanent care, he risked losing even more mobility. But Alvaro, who had always had the best at his disposal, discovered that his financial condition no longer allowed him the luxurious treatment he would have demanded in the past. In the days following the diagnosis, he was transferred to a public hospital, where the wait for care was long, resources were limited, and the health professionals, as dedicated as they were, had to attend to an overwhelming number of patients. For the first time in his life, Alvaro felt vulnerable and powerless. On one of those long, monotonous days in the hospital, Alvaro looked out the window and thought about his daughter. He felt a pang of guilt mixed with bitterness, remembering their last conversation, when he disinherited her without hesitation, with a coldness that now haunted him. At that time, he still believed he was right, that Louisa would return begging for forgiveness, pleading to be accepted back. But that never happened. Months had passed, and he hadn't heard from her. She must be suffering. She must be regretting it, he told himself in the early months. But over time, a doubt began to grow in his heart. What if she had truly found something he, with all his wealth and power, had never experienced? The thought disturbed him, yet he refused to believe it. After all, how could anyone prefer poverty to luxury? How could someone abandon everything for a beggar? Now, confined to that hospital bed, weakened and with no hope of recovery, Alvaro began to reflect on what it truly meant to have everything. He had watched his empire crumble, his prestige dissolve, and his friends vanish. The money that had always been his source of pride now seemed useless. He was alone, truly alone, on a particularly difficult night. As he heard the groans and cries of other patients in the adjacent room, Alvaro murmured to himself, feeling a tightness in his chest. Money is worthless if you have no one by your side. The words left his lips almost unconsciously, a bitter confession. As he stared at the ceiling, the memory of Luisa came flooding back, bringing a void he had long avoided confronting. He recalled her determined look the day she left, the strength in her voice when she said she'd rather be poor and happy than rich and empty like him. And for the first time, he admitted to himself that maybe she was right. Perhaps he really had lived an empty life, burdened by nothing but his pride and obsession with power. In the days that followed, a thought began to take root in his mind, one that terrified him and against which his pride fought with all its might. But the weight of loneliness, regret, and despair was stronger. With the little money he had left, he managed to rent a small room in a modest boarding house. Memories of the grand mansion haunted him, but he needed a place where he could reflect, a place to finally accept what he had always tried to ignore. Finally, on a cold morning, with trembling hands, Alvaro picked up an old cell phone and, with difficulty, looked up his daughter's number. He wasn't even sure if she would answer, if she still considered him worthy of a conversation. Even so, he typed a short message, feeling his heart grow heavier than ever. Luisa, this is your father. I know I made mistakes, and I know asking for forgiveness may be too much, but I need to see you. I need to talk to you. After sending the message, he held the phone, feeling more vulnerable than he ever had. He spent hours staring at the screen, waiting for a reply that might never come. But when the phone vibrated, his heart raced. The response was brief, yet loaded with something he hadn't expected. Father, I accept. Tell me where I can meet you. That simple phrase, so direct and without judgment, brought Alvaro an emotion he hadn't felt in years. A mixture of hope, regret, and perhaps a chance for redemption. As he arranged the meeting, he felt stripped of all the pride and identity that had once defined him. The powerful and feared man he once was seemed now like a distant shadow, and all that remained was an old, broken father, hoping for the chance to see the daughter he had cast aside. The small cafe where Luisa had agreed to meet her father was discreet, almost hidden on a quiet street, far from the city's hustle. When she arrived, her heart racing, she found a seat near the window and tried to calm herself. She didn't know what to expect. Her last memory of Alvaro was of a cold, arrogant man who preferred to sever all ties with her rather than accept the love she felt for Rafael. But life was different now, and so was she. She had been through trials, learned the value of humility and perseverance, and most importantly, discovered what truly mattered. She felt that meeting her father wasn't just for him. It was also for her. It was a chance to close a chapter of hurt and seek inner reconciliation. Alvaro arrived shortly afterward, wearing simple, modest clothes, a completely different image from the imposing man who once intimidated everyone with his impeccable suit and severe gaze. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane, with hunched shoulders and an expression that mingled exhaustion and vulnerability. When she saw him, Louisa almost didn't recognize him. Illness and time had transformed him into someone burdened with regret and deep sadness. He paused for a moment upon seeing her and took a deep breath before approaching. Louisa stood, feeling a mixture of compassion and surprise as she realized how fragile he looked. Their faces met, and for an instant, the silence between them spoke more than any words could. "Louisa," he began, his voice hoarse and low, as if each word cost him enormous effort. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." She nodded, still trying to absorb the image of her father before her, a man who seemed stripped of all the pride that had always defined him. "Father, I didn't know what to expect when I got your message. It's been so long." He nodded, looking away for a moment, ashamed. "I know. I failed you, Louisa. I thought I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting you. But now, I see that maybe I pushed you away from what truly mattered." The waiter approached, bringing coffee for both, and they sat in silence as he served them. Alvaro held the cup with trembling hands, and Louisa noticed he was more frail than she had imagined. The distant look, the tired expression, the slumped posture, everything about him indicated that this man was no longer the Alvaro Montenegro she had known. She watched him with compassion and asked in a low voice, "Father, what happened to you?" He let out a long sigh, as if the question brought to the surface all the demons he had tried to keep buried. Everything fell apart, Louisa. My empire, my fortune, my friends. They all disappeared when the money ran out. When my health failed. I always believed that money was what defined a person, but now I see I was wrong. When I needed help, those who surrounded me vanished. I was left alone, and, ironically, it was only when everything was lost that I began to see what really matters. She listened in silence, her gaze steady and attentive. The coldness she once felt toward him began to dissolve as he bared his soul before her. She realized that Alvaro's ruin wasn't only material. It was an internal collapse, a breakdown of everything he had once believed in. "Father, what you're saying," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "That's something I learned by Raphael's side. He showed me that true wealth is in people, in the relationships we build, in peace of mind. I tried to tell you that before, but you didn't want to listen." He nodded, his eyes brimming with tears, and finally looked at her with an expression of pain and regret. "I know. I was blind, Louisa. I was so obsessed with maintaining a status, with controlling everything around me, that I ended up losing you. And by losing you, I lost the only person who truly mattered in my life." Louisa felt a knot form in her throat, a mixture of old hurt and a pain she thought she had overcome. Seeing her father like this, so vulnerable, brought back memories of lonely nights, the emptiness he had never bothered to fill with love or affection. But at the same time, something within her felt that this moment was an opportunity to let him in, to accept what he now offered. She took a deep breath, trying to contain her emotions. "Father, do you really understand what Raphael and I have? It's not something that can be bought or negotiated. It's a love that doesn't depend on money, that doesn't depend on status. I chose this life because I found something more valuable than any wealth. I finally am happy." Alvaro nodded slowly, absorbing her words as a bitter yet liberating truth. "I never understood what happiness was, Louisa. To me, happiness was power, control, the assurance of never needing anyone. But now, I realized that wasn't happiness. It was loneliness disguised as success." Silence settled between them as they both stared at the cooling coffee in their cups. Finally, Alvaro spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "Louisa, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For treating you like an object, for imposing a life on you that you didn't want, for not being the father you deserved. She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. What he was saying was everything she had dreamed of hearing, everything she had always wanted him to understand. But now, seeing him there, broken and repentant, she realized that forgiveness was something she already carried within her. She no longer wanted to live with the weight of resentment. Raphael had taught her the importance of forgiveness, and now she felt it was time to put it into practice. "Father, I forgive you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not because you asked, but because I needed to move forward. The life I chose with Raphael has shown me that holding on to resentment only traps us. I don't want to live bound to the past anymore." Alvaro lowered his head, and she saw that he was crying. Silent tears ran down his face, and the rigidity that had always defined him seemed to have dissolved, leaving only an old, regretful man. "Thank you, Luisa," he whispered, his voice choked. "Thank you for giving me a chance, for giving me the opportunity to change." She smiled, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. "There's still time to start over, Father. I believe that. But now, you need to learn to live differently, to value what truly matters." Alvaro looked at her, and in his eyes, there was something new, a timid, almost childlike hope. He seemed small, stripped of all his former pomp and arrogance, and she realized that this was his first step toward redemption. After the meeting, Luisa shared everything that had happened with Raphael. Raphael, with his usual calm, listened attentively and smiled as he saw the peace in her eyes. When she finished, he took her hand and looked into her eyes. "You did what you needed to do, Luisa. Forgiveness is a gift, and now your father has the chance to learn to live in a way he never knew." Welcoming Alvaro into their lives wasn't easy for Luisa and Raphael, but they did so with open hearts. In the weeks that followed, they helped him find a small house close to their neighborhood. It was modest and simple, but he now treated it with a gratitude he had never known. Gradually, Alvaro began to approach Raphael, still with some difficulty, still bearing traces of his wounded pride. But Raphael, patient and generous, treated him with respect and warmth, never judging. Seeing the sincere love that Luisa and Raphael shared, Alvaro began to understand the value of humility and kindness. On peaceful days, Luisa and Raphael would invite him over for dinner, and Alvaro, little by little, began to feel part of a family for the first time, a real family, united not by blood but by love and acceptance. At first, he was still unsure, but gradually, he opened up, allowing himself to smile and even share stories from his youth, stories he had never told before. And it was on one of these nights, as he watched Luisa and Raphael smile together, hearing the laughter of the neighborhood children playing outside, that Alvaro felt a peace he had never known. It was a peace that came from within, a sense of belonging, acceptance, and love. He had lost everything he once considered important, but he had gained something far more precious: the chance to be, finally, a true father and a genuine man. As he looked at his daughter and son-in-law, Alvaro smiled, his eyes brimming with tears. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly happy. The weeks that followed were a period of learning and transformation for Alvaro. Living with Luisa and Raphael forced him to confront not only his past, but also his own frailties and limitations. The man he had been, arrogant, controlling, obsessed with power and money, was slowly giving way to someone humbler, more serene, someone who was beginning to understand the value of small things, simple gestures, and sincere affection. Living in a modest neighborhood, surrounded by people who knew the hardships of life, allowed Alvaro to see a world he had always ignored. Each day, He realized that the people around him, though materially poor, had a richness of spirit and genuine generosity that he had never encountered among his former circle of friends. At first, he remained reserved, wary, but gradually, he learned to receive the warmth and solidarity of those around him. One morning, as he went out for a walk, Alvaro encountered Dona Cecilia, the elderly neighbor who had helped Luisa and Rafael so much during their difficult times. She was sitting on the porch of her small house, watching the street with a peaceful smile. When she saw him, she waved him over. "Mr. Alvaro, why don't you sit down for a bit? The sun is beautiful today," she said with a welcoming smile. Alvaro hesitated, but eventually accepted the invitation. He sat beside her, and for a moment, they just watched the movement of the street in silence. Finally, he broke the silence. "You know, Dona Cecilia," he began, looking at his aged hands. "I never imagined I'd end my days like this. I thought I'd always have everything under control, that I'd be powerful and independent until the end." She smiled knowingly. "You've learned that life doesn't always follow our plans, haven't you? Sometimes we have to lose everything to understand what really matters." He nodded, absorbing those words that resonated with a profound truth. "And what really matters?" he asked, as though seeking an answer that had always eluded him. Dona Cecilia looked at him with gentle eyes that sparkled with wisdom. "People matter, Alvaro. The love we leave in the hearts of those around us matters. In the end, what counts is not what we accumulate, but what we give. And you still have time to give something valuable." Those words stayed with him through his walk back home. When he entered, he found Luisa preparing lunch, a serene expression of focus on her face. She smiled when she saw him. "Father, I'm glad you're back. Are you hungry?" He smiled back, still touched by Dona Cecilia's words. "Yes, I am, my daughter. And can I help with something?" She laughed, surprised. She had never thought she'd see her father, the former magnate, offering to help in the kitchen. But she nodded and guided him to chop some vegetables while she prepared the rest of the meal. They stayed there in silence, simply enjoying each other's company. It was a scene that seemed ordinary, but represented a new bond between them. At dinner that night, Alvaro was quieter than usual. Rafael noticed his thoughtful expression and asked, in his usual gentle tone, "Are you all right, Mr. Alvaro?" He looked up, studying his son-in-law's face, the man he had once despised but now deeply respected. Rafael was everything he had never been: humble, patient, kind. He knew Rafael had been Luisa's anchor, her pillar when he himself had abandoned her. And, in that moment, Alvaro felt grateful, something he had never imagined feeling towards someone he had once deemed unworthy. "Rafael," he began, choosing his words carefully. I know it's been a long time, and perhaps it's too late to ask forgiveness. But I want you to know that I respect you, that I'm grateful for everything you've done for Luisa. And I was wrong about you." Rafael smiled, a sincere smile, free of resentment. "Mr. Alvaro, there's no need to apologize. I understand how you felt. Luisa's love for me was difficult to accept. I know that. But now, I believe we were all meant for this journey, to learn from one another." Alvaro nodded, deeply moved. There was a peace in Rafael's gaze that touched him, a serenity that came from an unshakable faith, a spirituality he had never understood in his life of wealth and power. Over the following weeks, Alvaro continued attending dinners at Luisa and Rafael's home. With each visit, he learned more about love, humility, and generosity. Slowly, he began to feel like part of a family, finally finding a sense of belonging that money had never provided. He started sharing stories from his childhood, stories he had never shared with anyone. On evenings when the neighborhood children came to Raphael's house to listen to stories, he joined them, enchanted by the simplicity and joy the children brought. It was on one of those nights that something inside him changed forever. Raphael, with his calm voice and faith-filled gaze, spoke about the meaning of forgiveness, about how love could heal all wounds and transform even the hardest of hearts. Alvaro listened intently, and without realizing it, felt a tear slip down his face. He was no longer the cold, relentless man he once thought himself to be. He was just a man who, after so much suffering, was finally beginning to understand peace. One starry night, as everyone prepared to go to bed, Alvaro called Luisa and Raphael out to the small garden. They sat together, and Alvaro looked at the sky as if searching for the answer to everything he had lived. "Luisa, Raphael," he began, his voice trembling. "I spent my entire life believing that money defined me. I thought power would earn me respect, that fortune would bring me happiness. But after everything, I realize I wasted so many years chasing something empty." Raphael held his hand, and Luisa placed a hand on her father's shoulder, encouraging him to continue. "Today, with you by my side, I feel I've found something far more precious than money. I feel that I found my family, and I wanted to ask if it's still possible for you to accept me as part of it. Not as the old Alvaro Montenegro, the arrogant, insensitive man, but as a father, a grandfather to these children I love so much. Someone who finally understands what love is." With teary eyes, Luisa pulled her father into a tight embrace. "Father, you've always been part of my life, even when I tried to forget you. And now, I have no more resentment. We have each other, and that's all that matters." Raphael embraced him as well, and the three of them stood there, under the stars, feeling that at last, the bonds broken by pride and greed were being restored by forgiveness and love. That night, as Alvaro lay down in his modest bed, he closed his eyes with a serene smile. For the first time in many years, he felt at peace. There was no more resentment, no more fear or regret. He understood that he had been redeemed not only by his daughter's forgiveness, but by the unconditional love that now surrounded him. In the months that followed, Alvaro became a beloved figure in the neighborhood. He told stories to the children, helped with small daily tasks, and spent afternoons with Dona Cecilia, sharing laughter and memories. He was a changed man, someone who had finally found true happiness. A year later, on a sunny Sunday, Luisa, Raphael, and Alvaro attended the local church together. After the service, as families gathered in the square, Alvaro turned to his daughter and son-in-law, his eyes shining with renewed light. "Sometimes," he said, smiling, "we have to lose everything to find what really matters. And I found that by your side." Raphael patted his shoulder affectionately and added, "It's never too late to start anew." Alvaro Montenegro, once a powerful and relentless man, was now simply Alvaro, a loving father and grandfather, someone who understood the value of forgiveness and humility. He knew that life's true fortune was beside him, in the family he had finally embraced and that had accepted him back. As they walked together through the square, he looked up at the sky, feeling he had, at last, found peace. And with this new life, the cycle of love and redemption was complete. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.